Alright guys, how's it going? Sometimes you make a mistake so egregious that the situation is essentially unsalvageable. And that's what I did in my previous video, or at least according to the comments I received on Twitter, and also a few emails and private messages I got after releasing the video. So, the big thing that most people seemed excited about with Zen 5 was with my assumption that it will have 16 cores per chiplet. I laid out why I expected those rumours to be true. The fact that we've already had 16 cores on the desktop for so long, Zen 2 in fact. And also because Intel may very likely be moving to 40 cores with Arrow Lake coming after Meteor Lake. Those were the two major factors in my reasoning. Now, I did also have a few pieces of leaked info which strongly pointed to Zen 5 being 16 cores per chiplet. So with all that in mind, it's safe to say that my confidence was high here. However, it turns out that I was misled, or more accurately, I misled myself as to what the actual situation was. So, let me start this one by showing you where exactly I went wrong. Towards the end of 2021, I read Ian Cutress's interview with Mike Clark, AMD's chief architect of Zen. It's a great interview, as usual, and you should read the whole thing. And I give myself a little smile every time I see Ian trying his best to ask questions in a way that will get him the most info. And sometimes the interviewee even bites. But there's a couple of points in particular stood out to me. I mentioned this a few times during previous leak videos, but AMD's Zen strategy has always been to do a grounds up design, then to follow that up with a derivative, and then come back with another totally ground up design, where they've rethought everything through the pipeline. And we've seen that clearly enough. Zen 1 was a new core, Zen 2 was a derivative of that, Zen 3 was a new core, and Zen 4 was a derivative. So obviously next up, Zen 5 will be another new core. And that's where you tend to see the larger IPC gains, every other generation. And with that in mind, which I already knew, this could have been my first mistake here. But essentially, every 3 years AMD are pretty much redesigning it all. And that kind of explains why Zen 4 is a bit underwhelming, I think. Zen 2 is a slightly different beast because that's when we first saw true chiplets, when AMD separated the I/O and the cores. A bit further down, Mike started talking about Vcache and cache in general. A couple of points that he raised stood out to me. The more that you share a giant L3 across the threads, the latency of a given thread gets longer. So you're making a trade-off there of sharing or getting more capacity and a lower thread count versus the latency it takes to get it. So AMD have basically balanced it for trying to hit on that lower latency, while still providing great capacity at the L3 level. Mike continued with, going forward, getting more cores in a sharing L3 environment, AMD will still try to manage the latency so that when there are lower thread counts in the system, you still get good latency out of that L3. And then finally, a very interesting point, then there's the L2. If your L2 is bigger, then you can cut back on some of your L3 as well. Now, the same thing applies to L2 as well as L3. As the L2 size increases, the latency for any given thread also does. However, L2 size increases a lot slower than L3, so the increase in latencies are also smaller. I made a pretty decent video, in my humble opinion, on cache a few years back. This one here. I think this is one of my better technical videos, so feel free to check this out after you've watched this one. Ian then asked Mike about increasing the size of the CCX, noting that Zen started with a 4-core CCX, with the move to 8 cores only coming with Zen 3. And Mike responded with, "We do see core counts growing, and we will continue to increase the number of cores in our core complex that are shared under an L3. So I'll just say that the team is already looking at what it takes to grow to a complex far beyond where we are today, and how to deliver that in the future." And now to end this part of the video and the interview, Ian asked, finally, what should AMD users look forward to? With Mike responding, "I wish I could tell you all of what's coming. I have this annual architecture meeting where we go over everything that's going on, and at one of them, the team and I went through Zen 5. I learned a lot because nowadays, as running the roadmap, I don't get as close to the design as I wish I could. Coming out of that meeting, I just wanted to close my eyes, go to sleep, and then wake up and buy this thing. I want to be in the future. This thing is awesome, and it's going to be so great. I can't wait for it. And so there seems little question that Zen's chief architect believes that Zen 5 is going to be really, really something. So like I said, that was back in October 2021. I was having a pretty rough time of things personally right at that time, and so I put tech on the back burner for a while. But then at the start of 2022, I got some info from one of my best leakers, and my interest was piqued enough to ask for further information. I'll show you what I got, and I'll tell you the story about the discussions behind it. First up was this graph showing bandwidth per core, with and without CXL. And we can see at the bottom here, the core count goes past 190. And next up was this, epic core counts. Genoa, 96 cores we know, and Bergamo, 128 cores, we know. But now finally, I had the core counts, and the memory speeds, of Turin. 160 and 196 cores was the claim. And when I looked at this graph again, on closer inspection, there does seem to be a point right in between 150 and 170 cores, which obviously strongly suggests 160 cores. But wait, 196 cores? 196 divided by 8. 24.5. That does not work. Now obviously dividing by 16 won't work either, and neither does 12. The only number that fits here is 14. What's even stranger here is, we can see that the info includes some basic maths. 128 cores plus 53%, 128 plus 53% equals 196 cores. By now, this was confusing the hell out of me. So I got back to my source looking for some clarification. They told me that for data center, it's 160 and 192 cores. For cloud and HPC, there might be SKUs with 256 cores, but they couldn't confirm that 100%. And they also told me, if the core count is 14 per CCX, then 14 times 14 is 196. Before finishing with, not all 16 cores will be functional. Something still wasn't sitting quite right with me here. And in those cases, I normally fall back on another source that I have for further clarification. And this source has very, very good info, but they will not volunteer or leak anything to me. However, they are generally happy to confirm or deny stuff that I have got, especially if I provide charts and stuff like that. So we discussed this at length, and their heads were being scratched as well because of this. However, at the end, they were adamant and unflinching. Turin is 128 cores, and the smaller core version, that is, the one that's similar to Bergamo, that's 192 cores. And they told me that the CCX is 16 cores. Now all of this was about a year ago, and I just left it alone while getting back to real life. And the truth is, I just forgot about most of this. Vcache sparked a bit of excitement in me again though, and I began to realise just how much of a game changer that this is. Navi 30 helped with that as well. Basically, ever since I made my first master plan video, and I realised the huge benefits of smaller chip sizes, and how these benefits would rise almost exponentially as the process nodes got smaller and more expensive each time. Navi 30 cutting out the memory controllers and cache onto separate dies, this is a huge thing. It has left AMD with a huge amount of area to grow the Navi GCD if they wanted to. I'll be talking about that in my next video, however. Vcache is an even better version of this because the cache remains close to the main CPU chiplet. And because of that, the actual latency increase is only around 2 nanoseconds for Vcache compared to having the L3 cache on the same die, that is. yet it increases the amount of L3 by 200%. Remember back to what Mike was saying in the interview. So you might analyse this and think, removing the L3 entirely or nearly entirely from the main die and onto Vcache could have huge potential ramifications, especially when you consider that at 3nm, wafer prices are said to be north of $20,000. And again, we've all heard plenty about TSMC's rumours of 3nm yield issues, which have been going on for a couple of years now. After years of being seemingly unstoppable, TSMC clearly hit a snag or two on 3nm. At one point, yields well below 50% was the rumour, and that is nowhere near ready for high volume manufacturing. And just to give you an idea of the differences here, again I'm going to dig out the silicon cost calculator. Zen 3 on 7nm was 81 square millimeters, and so at 90% yield, and let's call it $10,000 a wafer, the cost per chiplet is $13.92. Change this yield to 50% though, and the cost rises to $25.06. Not quite double, but close enough. Now Zen 4 on 5nm, that's 66 square millimeters, and at 90% yield, and let's just call it 17k a wafer, that gives a cost per chiplet of $19.12. 50% yield, however, the cost rises to $34.41. Zen 3 was 81, Zen 4 was 66, that's 15 square millimeters. So let's just assume a similar sort of shrink of 15 square millimeters for Zen 5 on 3nm. I'll talk about that later, but for now, 51 square millimeters, 90% yield, and 20k a wafer means that the Zen 5 chiplet would cost around $17.20, and at 50% yield, it would cost $30.96. Now the first thing to note here is that even though that 3nm prices have risen again from 17 to 20k, the cost per die for AMD is less than what it probably was or is on 5nm. The difference is $2 at 90% yield and $3.50 at 50% yield. So that's not the problem. The main problem here obviously is the difference between 90% and 50% yield. So in the case of 3nm Zen 5, the difference between 90 and 50% yield is around $14 per chiplet. Now you might think, well, $14, that doesn't really seem huge, given the prices that AMD can command. However, it's large enough that over, say, 100 million chiplets, which probably isn't that far away from what AMD sells per year, if you consider Ryzen and Epic. Remember, Epic's got like, 8, 12 or whatever chiplets on a package. This is obviously going to start to add up to a very large figure. 100 million chiplets a year, spending an extra $14 per chiplet. That is $1.4 billion in fact. And when you consider that, it starts to make sense, right? When you consider the scale. Bear with me, this part could get tough going. Lokutsa on YouTube made a video analysing the Zen 4 chiplet. This was back in September last year. According to the measurements, the Zen 4 L3 cache was 25.1 square millimeters, whereas Zen 3's was 35.5. That's a 29% decrease in cache sizes between the two nodes. Same 32MB of L3. So if the Zen 4 cache is 25.1 square millimeters, and the whole chiplet is 66 square millimeters, that means that the chiplet without the L3 cache is 41 square millimeters. We've seen AMD's cache scaling slides in the past, showing how cache isn't scaling as well anymore as it used to. So if Zen 3's cache was 35.5, Zen 4's is 25.1, let's just assume that Zen 5's would be a flat 20 square millimeters. And remember, I assumed 51 square millimeters for Zen 5 on TSMC 3nm. So if you remove that L3 cache, that 20 square millimeters of L3 cache, from the die, we'd be left with a minuscule 31 square millimeter chiplet. So 31 square millimeters at 90% yield, 20,000 wafer price gives us a cost per silicon die of $10.29. At 50% yield, however, the cost rises to $18.53. But it's interesting to note that by removing the L3 cache, the cost at 50% yield is only around $1 more than the Zen 5 chiplet with L3 at 90% yield. $17.20 versus $18.53. Now, another dollar cost over 100 million chiplets. That's a simple 100 million bucks. And obviously, you're gonna need another Vcache chiplet and the bonding cost on top of that, if you remove the L3 from the main chiplet. And overall, to be blunt, that would probably run over $1 billion in costs for AMD. However, they'd now be on a Vcache architecture from the get-go, and the performance advantages from that would be crushing. They wouldn't do it though. The costs are clearly still just a bit too high. However, that is considering 50% yield, which is abysmal, and we know that yields just improve over the next year or two, which will dramatically lower these costs. And so I guess the last thing worth showing you here is what I wrongly believed Zen 5 would be, based on everything I've shown you over this video and the last one. But now you've probably figured that I believed Zen 5 would be TSMC 3nm, 16 cores, with either no L3 on die or a lot less. My personal belief was that they'd probably double the L2 cache to 2MB per core, and then just simply move all of the L3 onto the Vcache. That's how I thought that they would do it. Now, as just noted, Zen 5 with 8 cores and no L3 cache on the die would likely come in around 31 square millimeters. So you just need to double that core count without having any extra Infinity Fabric links or whatever. And then, as I said, why not just double the L2 for another 16MB of L2 cache? That chiplet would probably end up almost exactly double the size, or 62 square millimeters. And we can instantly see that a 62 square millimeter die with 50% yield on TSMC 3nm raises the cost to $38, which is way too high, and that's even without the Vcache die as well. However, at 90% yield, it's only $21. 16 cores with double L2 cache and no L3. That is only a couple of bucks higher than what AMD has basically been paying since Zen 3 and Zen 4. And it's only a couple of bucks higher than a Zen 3 with 8 cores with the L3 on the die. The performance advantages here I went over in the last video. They would be insane, and AMD could segment the market to their heart's content. Sure, it's around $10 more than what Zen 3 and Zen 4 cost them, but does anybody think that they couldn't charge at least another $50 for that kind of performance? But with all that said, Zen 5 is not 16 cores, and it's not on TSMC 3nm either. How could I get that so wrong? Well, Zen 5 is actually 16 cores, and it's also on TSMC 3nm. But it's not that Zen 5. It's the other one. Yep, the Bergamo type one. Zen 5C, Zen 5 Dense, whatever you want to call it. I got this slide too early, same as I did with Zen 4. Remember when I broke the news that Genoa was 128 cores, not 96? AMD didn't have the Bergamo codename by that point, but obviously I was on the right track. The same thing has happened again. I've had this slide showing Turin at 192 cores, that should obviously be. This here's just a typo. But this won't actually be called Turin when it launches. It'll have a new name, same as Bergamo had a new name from Genoa, even though they're both Zen 4. And as with Zen 4, there will be a normal version. There's also going to be a Vcache version, again, and the dense version. The normal version of Zen 5 is 8 core chiplets, and it is on TSMC 4nm, while the dense version, the one that goes up to 192 cores, that's the 16 core version, which is on TSMC 3nm. So all I can really do is hold up my hands and say, I really messed this up, and I'm pretty convinced AMD's messed it up as well. You might say TSMC has messed it up for them, forcing AMD to abandon their earlier plans, and I've had this confirmed by a couple of different sources. Analysing it now that I have the real info, it seems obvious enough that AMD will get onto 3nm as soon as that's ready for prime time, which is to say, as soon as it's approaching 80 or 90% yield. But whether or not they'll actually shrink Zen 5, the normal Zen 5, to 3nm, or maybe they'll just wait on Zen 6 instead, I've got no idea. We know that they have the technology. They've got a 16 core chiplet already. they've got the V cache, and we also know that they're stacking cache below the main compute die now, because they'll be doing that with MI3000, as Lisa talked about at ISSCC. So it's all there to do this. It just seems that they've decided not to risk it yet because of TSMC's earlier 3nm issues. And maybe one way to look at it is they've done the smart thing. If TSMC's 3nm is such a shit show, then what's the concern here? It's not as if Intel's going to be using it soon either, right? Well, it seems that Intel might be on 3nm sooner than expected. I reported on TSMC's 3nm woes a few times in the past, and I also noted that Intel were one of the main victims, as they had snapped up a whole lot of 3nm wafers. So this was around the time that I broke news of Arrow Lake P to you. There were a couple of big leaks in this video. First of all, the biggest one for me was that both the CPU and the GPU would be on TSMC 3nm. I also noted in that video that Intel were concerned about TSMC's ability to supply them, for what are now pretty obvious reasons. I'll discuss another big talking point later from this video, but for now, have a look at the slide that I got back then, and I'll go over a couple of interesting parts in it. This slide shows Intel's thoughts and plans for Arrow Lake P, which is their ultra portable chip, basically. All this stuff at the top here, this lays out their design and manufacturing plans and the time frame. But a lot of the interesting information is in the sections Key Takeaways and Key Assumptions below that. As I mentioned in the video, Arrow Lake P, codenamed Halo, would be targeting Apple and their premium notebook designs. The really interesting part though is next. Arrow Lake introduces LNC and SKT, so that's Line Cove, the P core is Line Cove, and SKT is Skymint, which is the efficiency core on N3. Also, GT3 will be on N3, and as before, I will talk about ADM later. But we can see clearly that Arrow Lake, at least the Halo part, was designed from the get-go as a majority TSMC product. That's what N3 is, that is TSMC 3nm. Intel's own 3nm node is called Intel 3. So all the major compute parts are on TSMC's 3nm. Below this we can see that one of their key assumptions though was that Arrow Lake Halo would get priority over Arrow Lake S, which is the desktop parts. And that's a pretty safe assumption given Intel focuses on mobile over desktop and have done for years. However, it can also be analysed that Arrow Lake S will also be fully fabbed at TSMC, just that Halo will get priority. And the last thing I note here, down the bottom, growing the die size beyond 80 square millimeters, that's talking about the GPU, would drive reassessment of TSMC wafer request to meet linearity. So it looks like Intel will be trying their hardest to keep these chiplets below 80 square millimeters. That could be the case for the CPU as well, which remember, it is only going to be 6 performance cores and 8 efficiency cores for Arrow Lake P Halo part. Now, with Meteor Lake, Intel did provide us with more details at Hot Chips 2022. That was back in August. We know it's this tile-based architecture. There's a GPU tile, there's a CPU tile, there's a SOC tile, and there's the I/O tile. And also there's a base tile housing all of this. And according to Hassan over at WCCF, the CPU tile will be fabbed using Intel 7, which we already knew, but the SOC tile and the I/O tiles will be fabbed on TSMC's 6nm node, with the GPU on TSMC's 5nm. Right, okay, fine, but wait a minute. What does that mean for Arrow Lake? Well, as you just saw, Intel's plan was for the GPU and CPU tiles to be fabbed on N3, TSMC's 3nm node. There's also a part here about the SOC and I/O dies being 100% reuse from Meteor Lake. So presumably, that's also TSMC 6nm. If you look at every Intel slide on Meteor Lake, and Arrow now, they claim that their own foundry, either Intel 4 or Intel 20A, or even Intel 18A, plus external. But now with Arrow Lake, it looks like the entire thing is being fabbed at TSMC. Or at least that was the plan based on that slide I showed. I just don't have enough information on this yet, and to be blunt, I haven't really been paying that much attention to Intel for years, in fact. Why would I? They've done nothing at all much exciting for years. But maybe now it's getting to the point where they do deserve a bit more attention. But just to finish this part, you remember ADM? I also first mentioned this way back in this Arrow Lake video. And after digging around a bit, I was informed that it might be Intel's own version of Vcache, except for the GPU, not the CPU. Stacked cache in other words. And if correct, that will also be fabbed at TSMC for obvious reasons. TSMC is who does the stacking currently. And I would guess that cache probably 6 nanometers, but that is just a guess. However, if Intel are able to stack cache on a GPU, there's nothing stopping them from stacking cache on a CPU either. And now, I don't believe for a minute that they're going to do this with Arrow Lake, not in the CPU, but it's still worth mentioning. We can see here that they did have some concerns over ADM on the GPU, which is why they're talking about de-risking it back then. Right, okay, so Intel has what looks to be a pretty decent product with Arrow Lake. Who cares though, when they've simply switched their own fab problems with TSMC's? TSMC's 3nm woes did seem to be never ending. It's clearly been their toughest node in a decade, maybe even longer. So very few were surprised to learn last month that there appears to be yet another delay, causing Intel to postpone Arrow Lake tiles to the fourth quarter of 2024. Which obviously means that Intel wouldn't be able to launch in volume until sometime in 2025. However, barely a day later, Intel CEO Pat Gelsinger came out with the strongest dismissal of that I have ever seen from him. And over the years we've got used to Intel CEOs wishful thinking, particularly when it came to their own process problems. Pat, however, spoke out against this latest rumour in such fashion that for me, it has to be false. And he said, I am somewhat amazed by some of these rumour mill discussions that come out. You might notice there were similar ones on Intel 4 a few months ago, and also with some of our other TSMC programs, which were patently false at the time as well. Before continuing with, the 3nm programs are on track, both with TSMC as well as our internal Intel 3 programs, Granite Rapids and Sierra Forest in particular. And concluding with, these rumours, like many others, will be proven by our execution to be firmly false. As CEO of Intel, he can't really say stuff like that when it's not true. Otherwise, he'll get into a shitload of trouble with the SEC. People read this kind of thing, think, Intel could be back, go out and buy a ton of stock. If it then transpires that this was never the case, Intel, and Pat probably, end up getting sued. And so to wrap this long video up, I am sorry if some of you feel like these last two videos have been something of a bait and switch. It wasn't the case. The simple fact here is I fucked it up. Zen 5 will start off at least on TSMC 4nm. TSMC 4nm is a minor update on 5nm. And we can also see from this slide that AMD appears to be retaining their policy of the base chiplet first, with Vcache chiplets coming later. Turin Dense, as I said, that's the 16 core part, but I don't think we're going to see this on the desktop. Some observers, some people on Twitter, have noted that perhaps AMD will follow a similar strategy to Intel. 8 large Zen 5 P cores and 16 of these Zen 5 dense E cores, but I really don't think so. To me, Zen 5 looks a hell of a lot like more of the same. But I'm not even confident in saying that. Remember back at the start of the video when Mike Clark said about Zen 5, I wish I could tell you all what's coming. Coming out of that meeting, I just wanted to close my eyes, go to sleep, and then wake up and buy this thing. I want to be in the future. This thing is awesome, and it's going to be so great. I can't wait for it. Does more of the same on TSMC 4nm sound like that to you? It doesn't to me either. But we don't know how much of what Mike says has to be thrown out the window because AMD were forced to go onto 4nm instead of 3nm. If that ever even was the case. Maybe AMD actually planned all along for N4 instead of N3. There's just not enough information there. However, if N4 is some kind of stopgap for AMD, it looks like they've gambled on the safe option. And now it looks that it hasn't appeared to have paid off. That's assuming, of course, TSMC really is on top of 3nm now. And recently we've heard that sub-50 yields are now between 60 and 80%, and now might even be above 80%. And if that is the case, it has to be to Intel's large benefit. They've got two pretty good cores. The P cores aren't hugely efficient like Zen is, but they are fast, and on TSMC's node, they'll be even more efficient. And clock speeds should easily go beyond 5 GHz. They might not hit 6 like with Raptor Lake, but they don't need to if they're another 20 to 40% IPC on top of that. And the E-cores are tiny and efficient, and they're only going to get better on TSMC as well. The main issue for Intel that I can see here is I just can't see how TSMC can possibly provide them with enough wafers for all of that silicon, at least not for Intel's classic market share. We know AMD's been churning out 7nm and 5nm chiplets in huge numbers, but they're only at about 25% or so of the market with that. So how is Intel providing for that market with all of these chiplets on TSMC? And with that said, what are they doing on their own nodes? If Arrow Lake is basically 90+% TSMC, what are they doing in their own fabs? These fabs need to be paid for. And yeah, sure, they're trying to grab more business as a foundry for other companies, but they're a long, long way from TSMC in that regard. The PC, however, is starting to get much more interesting though. For those of you that follow the stock market, Intel might just be pretty cheap. Now I would hold off on that personally until I at least saw what Meteor Lake brings to the table. This new tile layout needs to be proven first, and Meteor Lake will be the first proof of it. If there's anything wrong with this tile-based architecture, the benchmarks will undoubtedly show it. I would be looking out for latencies in particular. But if Meteor Lake looks reasonably solid, then we should also reasonably expect Arrow Lake to be a pretty large jump over that. As always, time will tell, and I will be keeping a much closer eye on Intel again, going forward. I'm done here though, but I will be back pretty sharpish again, because it looks like there's yet another reckoning due with the Radeon Technologies group. Catch you later, guys.